In the first millennium BCE, ancient Mesopotamian civilization pioneered the first true multinational empires in world history. The Assyrian Empire was the first of these. The Kingdom of Assyria emerged as a major regional power in the second millennium BCE. However, it was in the early first millennium BCE that the Assyrians expanded their realm into a huge empire covering much of the Middle East. The ancient kingdom of Assyria was located in present-day northern Iraq. It bordered eastern Syria and southeastern Asia Minor. It covered the most northerly portion of the Mesopotamian plain, with the river Tigris flowing through it. The land was flanked to the north and east by the Zagros Mountains, to the west and south by desert. The climate of northern Mesopotamia is cooler than in southern Mesopotamia, and the levels of rainfall higher. This means that irrigation is not essential to farming, though. As with agriculture in many parts of the world, it does allow more intensive farming than would otherwise be the case. Assyria belonged to the world of ancient Mesopotamia. However, whilst steeped in Mesopotamian culture from early times, Assyrian society developed some distinct features of its own. Its exposed position, bordering as it did lands of warlike mountain peoples and desert tribesmen, meant that its people developed a strong military tradition. This enabled them to survive periods of invasion and then to conquer the largest empire world history had yet seen. At its height, this empire stretched from Egypt to the Persian Gulf, taking in the areas covered by the modern countries of Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, plus parts of Jordan, Turkey, Armenia, and Iran. Assyrian was an integral part of the ancient Mesopotamian world and had come increasingly under the influence of Sumerian civilization from the 4th millennium onwards. In the 2nd millennium, it had become one of the great powers of the Bronze Age Middle East, along with the Hittite Empire, New Kingdom Egypt, and Babylon. As with all Mesopotamian states, Assyria was a monarchy. The king was the divinely appointed, all-powerful ruler of the Assyrian people. His titles claimed universal sovereignty: Great King, Mighty King, King of the Universe, King of the country of Ashur. Like all previous Mesopotamian monarchs, the king of Assyria was the national god's appointed representative on earth, in this case, Ashur's. He was the chief lawmaker, the chief administrator, and above all, the commander-in-chief of the Assyrian army. The king was surrounded by a large court of ministers, officials, and servants. His chief ministers included a chief of the army and a chancellor, who probably headed the large administrative staff. There were also palace officials who ran the huge royal household, buildings, and grounds. The role of some of these officials closest to the king, such as the chief cupbearer, must have blurred the line between domestic and public. If he was in the king's confidence, then he will certainly have exercised considerable influence over matters of state. The bulk of royal officials will have been recruited from the Assyrian aristocracy. Some, however, came from humble. A vast flow of correspondence reached the palace from all over the Assyrian realm and beyond, and staff of scribes would have been needed to deal with this, and senior officials and ministers would have had the responsibility of deciding which matters required the attention of the king himself. It is apparent that the great line of kings who ruled Assyria in its pomp dealt with all important matters of state personally, and probably a great deal more besides. The Assyrian monarchy was, again like all Mesopotamian monarchies, hereditary, from father to son. One of a reigning king's sons was designated crown prince and trained to succeed his father. Things did not always work out as smoothly as this suggests. The area of the Middle East dominated by Assyria was divided into the Assyrian homeland, the Kingdom of Assyria, and a much larger area. In earlier times, this was covered by vassal kingdoms, but later, much of it was governed directly from the Assyrian court through provincial governors. At the center, if not geographically, certainly politically and socially, stood the Assyrian homeland. Here was located the Assyrian capital, with its magnificent palaces, parks, and temples. The original capital, Ashur, was also the center of the worship of the chief god of the same name, and long after it had ceased to be the center of government was revered as a holy city. Nineveh was the capital of the Assyrian Empire at the time of its heyday, and as such was certainly one of the largest cities in the world at that time. Other capital cities at different times were Nimrud and, briefly, under Sargon II, Dur-Sharrukin, which means Sargon's fortress. The Assyrians were farmers like all pre-industrial peoples. All land theoretically belonged to the king, and in reality the king did indeed own vast estates. A landed aristocracy also controlled much land, however, and through holding local public office these probably dominated many localities. It may well have been to reduce their influence at court that Assyrian kings shifted their capital from time to time. All Assyrians owed duties to the king. All adult males were liable to military service, and the core of the Assyrian army was made up of such men. When not on campaign, they formed a reserve from which soldiers could be recruited. At critical times, a large percentage, perhaps even the majority, of the younger men would be called up. Assyrians could also be summoned to undertake other kinds of service, for example, working on the royal estates or on large-scale royal construction projects. Away from the capital, the Assyrian homeland was divided into a number of districts. Tiglath-Pileser's reforms made these local divisions smaller and more numerous, bringing them more directly under the control of the central government. These districts were in turn divided into sub-districts under local chiefs, probably appointed from a member of a leading local family, and these were divided into townships. Up to the mid-8th century, the Assyrian homeland was surrounded by an expanding swathe of territory in Mesopotamia, Syria, eastern Anatolia, and western Iran, a significant chunk of the Middle East, composed of vassal kingdoms owing obedience to the Assyrian king, sending troops to fight with the Assyrian army, and paying tribute to the Assyrian court. Most of these vassal kingdoms were small states. The exception to this was southern Mesopotamia, which since the days of Hammurabi had been mostly ruled from Babylon. This key economic region was the core area of Mesopotamian civilization, and was treated with much more respect and consideration than other parts of the Assyrian sphere of influence. Here, the Assyrian king posed as a protector of the king of Babylon, fighting on his behalf against his enemies. In return, he expected obedience. Up to the mid-8th century, the Assyrian homeland and the much larger and expanding territory occupied by vassal kingdoms made up the two zones of Assyrian power. From the time of the reforms of King Tiglath-Pileser, a third zone was interposed between these two older ones, as a large part of Assyrian-dominated territory was brought under the more direct control of the Assyrian court.